Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Gemara Sukkah. So we are Tess Amud base, top of the page. We've been asked to start at the Mishnah at the very top. All right. Okay. So Mishnah says, so someone makes a sukkah under a tree, meaning under the branches of the tree, right? Didn't dig underneath the ground. An underground sukkah could be a separate issue, but he's made it under the branches of the tree. It's as if he made it in the house. Now the Gemara is going to discuss this. The fact that we particularly compared it to inside a house is to teach us something. Why? Because we're going to see it's the same pasuk, the same verse that teaches us you can't have it in a house is going to teach you can't have it under a tree. So one is not necessarily a bigger chiddush. One's not more novel than the other. They're essentially the same thing. So the fact that it compares it is going to show us parameters. So we'll come to that in the Gemara, but just to point that out. Next case, sukkah al gabi sukkah. He builds a sukkah on top of a sukkah. He's got a 2-story sukkah. So the roof of one, the roof of the lower level is the ground of the top level. You know, I've always wondered logistically how that works, because I can imagine someone walking on the roof of my sukkah and they'd be inside my sukkah pretty quick. So I'm not sure exactly. I mean, the truth is you could have like tree trunks. I mean, you could theoretically you'd have to have very strong structure, to hold up that schach. But it could work in theory. But so he's got a sukkah on top of a sukkah. So what's the din? The top one is kosher, and the bottom one is posel. It's no good. So again, it's this idea of having another layer of roofing, and it's different to at least this one is a kosher skach, as opposed to a tree or inside a house. And again, in the Gemara, we probably won't get to that today. But Rabbi Smith, you'll get to it, and you'll see what's the issue of having 2 layers. Why is that considered one thick layer? What's the difference?
Rabbi,
yeah,
I have a picture that I can share. Share the screen,
please. Yeah, there we go.
There it is.
That's it. Okay.
You just need thicker bamboo for the poles on the bottom one.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, you could use actual tree trunks. I mean, you could make a good but I remember, learning the Mishnayos as a youngster, and I was always envisioning someone falling straight through. But anyway, okay. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer.
Yeah.
Rabbi Yehuda says, okay. Rabbi Yehuda says, Im ein diyorim bel yoino. If there's no one actually living in the upper sukkah, hatachtoina kasheira. Now he says then the bottom one is kosher. So he differentiates. It's not necessarily the 2 layers of schach. It's whether the upper one is a functioning sukkah or not. And again, in the Gemara, we're gonna see why he makes that distinction. So that's the Mishnah. Sum up the Mishnah. We've got 2 situations, 2 cases. Case number 1 is if we build a sukkah under the canopy of a tree, under the canopy of the tree branches, it's no good. It's like you built it inside a house. And the first thing the Gemara is going to explain the connection to the house. While you see the other situation, we said it's kosher, posel. We didn't use that expression. We said it's like in a house.
Rabbi.
The second situation, yeah.
We mentioned this the first time around, but we didn't really come to any conclusion. is there a difference between a person who's building his sukkah under the tree, or he builds the sukkah and then the tree grows over it?
There's no difference. There could be a difference if the tree grows in it, but meaning into the schach. We'll speak about that a little bit shortly. But at this stage, if once it's covered,
Makes
it's
no
problematic.
difference which one came
Yeah.
first.
Yeah, it makes no difference. And the second case in the Mishnah is we built a 2-story sukkah, one sukkah on top of another sukkah. So according to the Tanna Kamma, the first opinion in the Mishnah, the upper one is kosher and the bottom one is never kosher. It's always possible. While Rabbi Yehuda makes a distinction, he says only if someone's living in the upper level, there's a problem. If there's no one living in the upper level, there's no problem. Okay, that's the Mishnah.
With the first case where he's building the sukkah under the tree, he's actually doing an action. But in the second case, he builds a sukkah, he goes away and comes back a year later. He didn't do anything.
The tree grew over. But the issue is whether the schach is effective. It's got nothing to do with his action. Right? It's all about whether the schach is what's creating the shade. Right? So we even have situations where if the sukkah is very tall compared to the width, and so the shade is coming from the walls as opposed to the roof. Even though the schach is kosher, there's nothing on top, the wall, otherwise everything is good. Just the issue is you have very high walls in a narrow sukkah, so the shade comes from the walls and not from the roof, from the schach. That also problematic. And at a certain point it becomes possible as well. So the issue is not his action. The issue is what's creating the shade, the schach or something else. Okay. Gemara.
I lived in Crown Heights, and some of the sukkahs, there are these two huge buildings, and there's this like an alleyway in the middle, and they just so there's two walls which are from the two buildings there that are like multi-story buildings, and the alleyway is what's creating that's two walls, and then they put up another one wall or two walls and put some schach. And that's exactly the situation that you're describing.
Okay, so it could be problematic. I mean, also depends which way the sun's coming. The sun's coming from the gap. If they built the direction that the sun's come from the front and back as opposed to the sides, that might not be a problem. Or it could be they've made a mistake. I mean, God forbid, I don't want people to miss out on the mitzvah. But at a certain point, becomes an issue. So Gemara, Omar Rava. So Rava points out, when we say that the building a sukkah under the roof, under a canopy of trees is a problem, this din was only taught in a situation where the tree shade is greater than the sunlight. Right? There's a few thinly sparse, there's one little branch going over with a few little leaves. It's a very thin canopy. It's not an issue. It's only an issue where you have a situation where this canopy of branches is creating more shade than sunlight. But if the sunlight is greater than the shade, so it's a very thin layer of branches, and pretty much the sun is coming through, kesheira, it's kosher. So this is a statement he makes. Then mamai, from how do you know this? Okay, it's a very nice statement. We appreciate you. We appreciate Rava making this statement for us. But number one rule of Gemara is we never trust anyone.
Says who?
Thank you. Proving my point. Right. So that's our number one statement in learning is we never trust anyone. What's your source? And without getting sidetracked, it's very, very interesting sometimes if you ever go to Rashi and Chumash in depth, and you look up some of the sources, you'll see some of the sources are not always exactly the way Rashi brings them, and there's very interesting discussions as to why Rashi does it, or why Rashi takes a slightly different method. So you can't even trust Rashi sometimes, because you trust him, but saying you need to go into it yourself. So we're not taking Rava's word for this. We want to know, where do you know this din from? Why does the thickness of the canopy, how much sunlight comes through, make any difference? So he says, it's from the fact that the Mishnah taught, it's as if he built it, he made it inside the house. What's special about that wording? Lamali, the Mishnah why does the Tana teach? Why does he use that wording? Why say it's as if he built it in the house? Listen, Pasula. He should have just said it's possible. You build it under a canopy, it's possible. No good. Finished. What's this whole, it's as if you built it inside a house. Okay, so besides the fact it's unusual wording, it's not being clear, we also have to understand, when one of the things you learn in Gemara, you'll see that we have a Mishnah, and the Mishnah is very concise. And often what happens is the Gemara brings a brisa, often that brisa is the source material for the Mishnah, and with so much more detail, sometimes extra opinions, sometimes reasons given, which are not brought in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is extremely concise. How come? Right? Because we have to understand that this was a revolution. Till that point, Torah Shebal Peh, the oral Torah, had never been written down as an official version. Right? Yes, people took their notes. That's what the brises and Toseftas and various things became the Mishnayos. It was from the yeshiva's personal notes, but it was always a personal, private idea. To have public lessons of Torah Shebal Peh, of oral Torah written down, not only never happened, it was considered forbidden. It is forbidden. But it was an emergency situation. The various persecutions, the situation caused, became a necessity to write down Torah Shebal Peh, otherwise it would become forgotten, God forbid. Nevertheless, when Rabbi Yehuda Nossi edited, they often say that he wrote the Mishnah. He didn't really write it. The basic structure came from Rabbi Akiva, who he needed a method. He came to learning late, so he needed a method. So the basic structure came from him. It was primarily fleshed out to the version we have today by Rabbi Meir, right, who was Rabbi Akiva's student, and that's why 99% of the time, when we have a statement without saying a name, it's Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, Stam Mishnah, that's right. So he edited it, but he edited to the point, since it was forbidden to write down Torah Shebal Peh, the oral Torah, he went out of his way. There shouldn't be one extra word. It should be the barest minimum, which, by the way, we see Gemara went to the opposite. Because we saw that, unfortunately, that was a good idea at the time. It didn't really work. It made it ended up a lot of lack of clarity, and therefore the Gemara went to the other extreme. We'll say, well, is this what it means? Even though we know the answer, is this what it means? Prove it's not. Is it this? Or prove it's not. Then we'll come to what it really is, and we'll have 10 challenges to prove that it is, because we want to make it very, very clear. Right? It was the next extreme, because we saw that being too concise led to lack of clarity. So Rabbi Yehuda Nossi is going out of his way to be as succinct and exact as possible. So he should have just said possible. Instead, we've got this whole extra phrase. What's the reason? Elo hakmashmalan. So rather must be coming to teach us the following. the ilan dumya dabayis, that the tree that we're talking about has to be similar to a house. And what do we know about a house? Ma bais losin meruba mechamasoi, just as a house, if its shade is greater than its sunlight, that's the problem. So if for some reason you had a house where the sunlight is greater than the shade, you got a big hole in the roof, so it might be time to get a new house. But if you had such a house, a sukkah underneath is not a problem. So it's only a problem when the shade is greater than the sunlight. Af ilon, so also the tree that we're speaking about here, we're only speaking about a tree that its shade is greater than the sunlight. And just as a side point, we see many people today in houses, they build a retractable roof, room in the house. It's more common in New York where you don't have yards, and these places. So people in apartment buildings and different things, so it becomes more of a necessity than areas where we have nice backyards. But they have retractable roofs, and inside they make the sukkah. So they might have a sukkah. Their dining room becomes a sukkah. So here we have a roof where when it's open, in the house, there's more sunlight than shade. Yeah, there's a few beams that run across or something, but generally speaking, there's more sunlight than shade, and that's sukkah is kosher, presuming everything else is as it should be, right? But in respect to the roof, it becomes kosher. So since the Mishnah compared this canopy of trees to a roof, we see it has the same din as a roof. And the roof of a house is only a problem if it has more shade than sunlight. Okay. So that's Rav's statement. He's brought his proof. And now we're going to challenge this proof. Right? We never take anything for granted. So ask the Gemara. So the tree's sunlight is greater than the shade. My hava, who cares? In other words, why should that make a difference? So you have a tree, and you've got it's a thin canopy. Sunlight's coming through. Why should that make a difference? What's the difference? We know what's going to happen. Sorry, if the tree's sunlight is greater than the shade, we're saying, why should that make the difference? Why should that make the difference if the sunlight is more than the shade? We have a situation where invalid schach covering is now mixed with kosher covering, right? So we're gonna discuss the situation we have later. Let's say the person has a sukkah, and next to it is a vine of some sort. And what does he do? He trains the vines over the top of his sukkah structure, so he ends up that his schach of his sukkah is a mix. You have kosher schach, let's say he's bamboo or palm leaves or whatever he happens to have, and mixed in it are these vines which are not good because they're still connected to the ground, right? One of the things the schach need to be not only it's something grows on the ground, it has to be something that grows that is currently off from the ground. When it's connected to the ground, it's no good. So if he would have a situation where all or majority of the schach was this vine or vines, and he trained it over, so even though from the inside it looks like a regular sukkah, but that sukkah is no good because the schach is still connected, it's invalid. So even if the sukkah on its own had more shade than sun, so even if without this invalid schach, it was good enough. Having the overhang, this should make at least that part no good, because that part is already shielded by the branch. Let's give a different example. Let's say, for an example, Many people, when they build a sukkah next to their house, right, they use a wall of their house as a wall of the sukkah. Sometimes, often the roof overhangs the wall, right? So as long as it's not too big, so most houses are not too big, as long as that overhang is not too large, we consider that in halacha a bent wall. You know, the walls don't have to be perfectly straight. So it's like a bent wall. And it can still be a wall. Again, once it gets too big, then it's considered roofing. But as long as within limits, it's a bent wall. So even though that's good for a wall, but the part of the sukkah, you know, part of the interior that's directly under that piece, that's not good. So you can't sit there. You know, let's give another example. Let's say a person, well, it's next to the house or not, relevant in this example. He built a sukkah, and part of the sukkah, let's say one end, you know, to hold it together, he put a big planks of wood across the top, and that's what holds it together. So those planks, if they're big enough, they're not kosher for schach. They're not any good. So under those planks is not considered a sukkah, while the rest of the structure is. You know, he has a let's say it's 8 foot long and 6 foot length of it. The entire length is all schach. So he's got his 3 kosher walls that are 6 foot long and whatever the width, and there's all nice kosher schach on top. That's all good. But the part that has invalid schach, that's not good. So what happens is that whenever you have a mixture of valid, of kosher and non-kosher, kosher and posel, valid and invalid schach, although the sukkah might remain kosher, if the majority of the sukkah is still good, but under, whatever's directly underneath the invalid, that's no good. Because even if this roof in of itself would provide more shade than sun, but the invalid is already blocking the sun. The invalid schach is already blocking the sun, so it doesn't matter that the kosher roof is underneath. It's shaded already. So that's our question. So Rava is trying to say that when you build the tree under the canopy, if the canopy, you build the sukkah under the canopy of a tree, if the canopy has more sunlight than shade, there's very little shade, it shouldn't be a problem. Our challenge to this is, it still creates a problem. It should create a problem. Why are you saying there's no problem? Part of this sukkah, at least part, is underneath a invalid, apostle piece of schach. There's a branch blocking part of the sukkah. At the minimum, that part of the sukkah should be no good. So why are you saying there's no problem? Okay. So it's a good question. So the Gemara is Omar Papa. Papa is going to answer. Shechavatam. We're talking about where he lowered the branches. What does it mean that he lowered them? So let's go back to the case of, so he's mixed them into the schach. Let's go back to the case that I gave before about the vines. It's not in our Gemara, but just to contrast it, to understand it. If he had a sukkah, and the sukkah is kosher, has majority, the schach has majority shade, very little sunlight, and next to it is this grapevine. And what does he do? He trains it over the top. Now, it's not going over the top, meaning another layer. It's now intermingled in his schach, right? It's mixed in. So as long as it's a minority, and later on the Gemara, you'll see how small a minority has to be. Won't get that today. But as long as it's small enough minority, we say it doesn't exist. Right? If the roof would be good otherwise, and you have a small amount, you know, at a certain point in halacha, you know, I mean, let's say nothing else is growing, right? You have a perfect palm branch. Those in Florida, right? Nice, beautiful palm branch sukkah. Well, there's some dust on those palm branches. It's not 100% palm branch. There's some other substance there, and it could even be not only dust. Something else. A bird flew over. There's something else there. So it only becomes a problem where it creates a problem. It starts being the source of the shade. That's when it creates a problem. Till that point, we recognize it's there, but it's halakhically as if it's not there because it's not doing anything. It's not achieving anything. Some dust on the palm branches did not create shade. So it doesn't achieve anything. That's why it's not there. So if you have a few little thin grapevine pieces, they're very thin, and it's mixed into this thick canopy of palm branches, it's not achieving anything, or achieves very, very little. And so therefore it's like bottle. It's as nullified, it's as if it's not there. So that's what we're saying here. So let's go back. Again, Rabba said, building a sukkah under canopy is only a problem if the canopy provides the shade. If the canopy is so thin that it does not create shade, there's no problem. So we pointed out, but it should be a problem because, okay, you got a branch, has very thin foliage, so it's really not creating much shade, but at least what's under that branch should be blocked. That branch is shading a piece of the sukkah. At least that piece of the sukkah should be no good. So
Rebbe?
answer Rav Papa, yes.
What about plastic? If you have transparent plastic wrapping, it provides no shade at all, but it gives you a cover like for rain or something like that. The shade is only from the schach, but you have a transparent plastic cover.
Yeah. Okay, that's still a problem because you have a covering that's not the schach. It's not kosher for schach.
I know. I'm just wondering. I'm trying to figure out why. If the question is shade, here you have something that gives you no shade.
It's also, it blocks the elements. We're going to see there's other. It's a great thing to spread over when you're not using the sukkah, right? Shabbos you might have a problem, putting it over, but it has to be partly over already, otherwise it makes a problem. Can be problematic, but for laws of Shabbos. But over here, because the schach has to be something that grows in the ground. So I understand what you're saying, that it's not providing shade per se, but it's still providing a coverage. Yes. A coverage is something that's invalid. But over here, the issue is we have effective coverage, and this branch it's not overrunning the sukkah. The only issue is the shade issue. It otherwise, except for the fact it's connected to the ground, it's otherwise a good piece of schach. But the issue is it's blocking a piece, and so our Papa explains what Rava meant was when you lowered it, so you mingled it in, and it became nullified into the schach itself. It's a thin little branch. It's obviously not, again, if it has a certain width, it's not going to be insignificant. But this branch is, and I guess if you can bend it to lower it, it's a thin branch, and so this branch is insignificant. Okay, we're still not satisfied. So what, you lowered it? My lamemra, still. Then why would he need to say it? That's obvious, right? The fact that the Mishnah has used these extra words to say that it's as if you built it inside a house. If what you're trying to teach us, if you want to say that that phrase is coming to teach us that if you take this thin little twig branch and mix it into a kosher roof, an otherwise kosher roof, it becomes nullified. The Mishnah didn't need to say that. We've got this din in 5 other places. I mean, I made up the number 5, but I mean, it's in, we have this din elsewhere. That's not a novelty. So if you are saying that's the situation, Maila Meimra, why would the Mishnah need, why would the Tana need to teach us that? It's obvious, right? If we go through the whole Masechta and we put all the pieces together, that's an obvious law. So he explains why it's not so obvious. Why isn't it so obvious? Mao de Tema, you might have thought Nigzer, they would have made a decree. I mean, you are correct. It might be obvious that this is kosher, but only after the fact. You might have thought a decree was made. The sages made a decree, that we would ban lowering branches, a rabbinic decree, lowering a branch and mixing it into the schach, because if people think you can have a branch there, they might leave a branch that's not lowered. If people grow up building sukkahs and they mix branches in, they go, oh, you're allowed to build under a tree. Not realizing, you know what the difference is? Over here, they pulled down the branch. This is a thin little nothing branch, and they were able to mix it into a kosher schach, and it became nullified. And they won't realize that was the fundamental difference. And they'll think, I can build them right next to the tree trunk. But this other tree has big branches that you can't lower down. And so to avoid that misunderstanding from occurring, you might have thought there's a rabbinic decree, you cannot do this. It might be kosher, this after the fact, somehow it happened. But to actually, l'chatchila, in the first instance, build your sukkah that way, we would never allow it. Mashmalan, so the Mishnah comes and teaches us, the loy gazrinon, we do not make such a decree. You can do this. Right, my backyard is person's got a smaller courtyard rather than a bigger yard, and he's only got this limited space to build the sukkah, and he's got this thin little wispy tree there. In the first instance, chatchila, he can pull down those branches. I mean, providing they can be pulled down, and tie them into his kosher schach, or interweave it, intermingle it, no problem. So that's what it's teaching us. That's why we have this wording. The wording is this unusual phrase. Instead of just saying posel, the fact that it says it's as if he built it inside the house is to teach us that building under a tree is only problematic if the tree provides more light. There's a separate problem, as the Gemara points out, even if it's less light, if you've got a branch, at least what's under the branch could be a problem. That's a case our mission doesn't speak about. But if we have thin little wispy branches and we mix them into our kosher schach, we lower it and pull it in to mingle it, then it does not create a problem for us. Okay, and now that we've said this, that there's no decree, we're going to back it up. We're going to bring some proof that this is the meaning of our Mishnah. Hanami tenina, and we've learned this in a Mishnah as well. And I think the next Mishnah. What's the next? What does it say? Hidlo aleha es a gefen ves a dalas ves a kisois. A person, he's got a grapevine, he's got some gourds or an ivy. He's growing next to the sukkah, and he lifts up these branches, and he puts them over the frame of the sukkah, the sikech al gabam, and then he covered them with proper schach. It's got a proper level of schach there. So he said, Sulah, this is no good. Now, the im haya sikach harba mehem, but if the schach is much more, it exceeds them, right? So instead of having now a whole covering of branches, so the first clause, you have this nice good covering of grapevines and different things, doesn't matter you put schach on top, it's no good. But if the schach, it's, let's just say it's 85% schach and 15% a few vines, or you cut off the vines, you detach them, you cut them from being connected to the ground, then kashera becomes kosher. So what do we see from this case? The cutting them off, I mean, that's I guess the kiddush is that they were put there before they were cut off. That's a novelty, but that's not the part that's relevant to our din. Part that's relevant to our Mishnah is we see that if it's minute, if it's a minute percentage mixed into the kosher schach, the invalid schach does not create a problem. It doesn't invalidate the sukkah. But if it's a significant percentage, then it does invalidate the sukkah. So to give the explanation of our Mishnah that there was just a small amount of tree with far more sunlight than shade, so that makes it insignificant. It's obviously an insignificant amount, otherwise it would be more shade. And we've intermingled it into the kosher schach, then it's like it's not there. Okay. We're still not satisfied. Still not satisfied. So what's the Gemara going to say now? Echidami. What case are we talking about? In other words, what do we mean like this? We said in the case we just brought to try and back up the pshat explanation we gave in our Mishnah. We said if the majority is kosher schach, it's good. If the majority is invalid schach, it's not good. So heichidami, what exactly is that case? We want to really get to nitty gritty and understand exactly what happened there, so we can understand how it applies here. If you want to say that he didn't lower the grapevine into the schach, in other words, he didn't intermingle them, then then why? Right? It should for sure be no good, right? Because you've got schach posel, got invalid, meaning the grapevine. It's combining with schach kosher, and the combination is what's creating the shade. If the shade from the kosher, the good schach, it did not create enough shade on its own, it now only created enough shade to make more shade than sunlight. Now that it has this other stuff mixed in, then obviously it's not kosher. Elalav keshchavoton. So it must be, we're talking about where he lowered the vines into the kosher schach, and it's now good because the kosher schach invalidated, it nullified the schach. In other words, it can only be invalidated when it's mixed in, when it's intermingled. If it's not intermingled, it can't become bottle, it can't become secondary. It's a separate item. And from here we see the Legazrinon. We don't decree that this is a problem, right? So we see from there, we see the decree from that case. Okay, so I probably made it sound a little more complicated than it was. Let me try and simplify the Gemara's question now. We have explained our Mishnah in the following way. We said, you know why our Mishnah has this unusual wording of the building on a tree canopy is like in a house? Because it wants to teach the following case, that if you had a very thin canopy, a canopy that allows more sunlight than shade, and you are allowed to pull it down and mix it into the schach, you can do this lechatchila, you can do this in the first instance. There's no decree, there's no gezeira stopping you doing that. That's the point of that wording, to tell you that you're allowed to do that. Okay, is that part clear?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
So the problem that we're asking or we're raising here is that we see this decree is taught in the next Mishnah. Don't need to teach it twice. How do we see it in the next Mishnah? Our next Mishnah is speaking about that if you mix the grapevine into these skach, then it's still kosher. So what do we see there? What do we see? Is that it had to be that he actually lowered it. He mixed in the grapevine. Because if he didn't, you now have two levels of skach. You have a kosher level and a non-kosher level. And that shouldn't be kosher because it becomes a separate entity. And when it's separate, it doesn't become nullified. And seemingly, it's the combination of these two levels that is creating the shade. So it must be, it was intermingled in, and because it was such a minority intermingled, it's become nullified. And therefore, it's a kosher schach. It's kosher roof. So we see clearly from the next Mishnah that there's no decree because you're allowed to do this. You're allowed to take it, they'll take these grapevines and intermingle it and nullify it. So we see from there's no decree. So why, if there's no decree, why would you need teachers no decree here? Well, and if you do teach it here, why teach it there? Right? You don't need both. So again, we're left with this question, why this unusual wording? And so we finish this piece, and we explain why we need unusual wording here. Mal detema, because you might have thought, from the next Mishnah, you might have thought, honey, Millie, when does it apply that such a sukkah is kosher when you have this grapevine mixed in? B'diavad, after the fact. No, this is what happened. You had some grapevines there, they got mixed in, and now it's kosher. But to initially make it like that, we would think you can't use it. You can't use such a sukkah. So we might say that there is a decree. From the next Mishnah, we only see after the fact. After the fact, did I do the mitzvah or not? Yeah, it happened. But you might think you're not allowed to do it. It doesn't show there wasn't a decree. The next case, it only shows what the din is after it happened. So Kamash Malan, so therefore the Tana is teaching us in our Mishnah, you are allowed to do this in the first instance. It's 100% permitted. There's no rabbinical decree against it. It's no problem. Okay. So that's that piece. Yes. You're on mute.
Now I'm okay. So it seems to me the picture they're drawing is of a low tree that is wispy, like you said, and the branches actually just about touch the top of the sukkah. Not a tall tree like an oak tree that's 40 feet above that and has branches you can't even reach. You couldn't pull them down. You couldn't. So
in this case, correct.
And it's not telling you. It's what it doesn't tell you is also important. Like the next Mishnah, to cut those branches.
Right. So, just one point before we just discuss what you said. When you mention a very tall tree, sometimes a very tall tree may also not be an issue because it's not actually casting shade because of its height or significant shade. So tall enough could also be, but in this case, what was correct? So what you said is correct. We're talking about it's a low tree with a very thin canopy, and we're able to tie it in. That's the specific case. And That's why we've used that's why we've used the wording. It's as if he built it in a house. So if you would have a house with a broken roof, a broken open roof, and there's like a few little, I don't know, whatever, whatever happens to be, if it's all open, there's no problem. If you got one thick beam that goes across, so that part maybe is no good. If you got a few little bits of nothing that can sit on your roof, is no problem. So we're making exactly parallel. That's the purpose. And so when it comes to, let's say, a vine, for example, the next mission is not speaking about whether you're allowed to do it. We're just saying after the fact, or potentially after the fact, is it kosher, not kosher. So if he's got a layer of it, it's no good. If it's intermixed, it's interspersed and it's a minority, or you cut it off, so now it's kosher schach, then it becomes kosher. Over here, it's not cut off, and what it's teaching us by saying it's like a roof is that you're just like you could build it into the house with a broken roof in the first instance. The fact that there was a roof or there's a bit of a roof does not invalidate the sukkah. The same thing here, by putting these vines, mixing them in, or vines, whatever happens to be, the thin branches, mix them in. You're allowed to do it in the first instance. That's 100% kosher sukkah, and it's not just after the fact, it's chatchila.
Very interesting.
So let's, before we go to yeah.
Because we did discuss the broken roof once before too.
Yeah.
In an earlier mission.
And that's what we get. So instead of teaching us all these laws again in the Mishnah, he says it's like the roof. And then we see whatever applies there applies here. So before we start the next piece, let's just summarize this piece. Our Mishnah, instead of saying that if it's built under a tree, it's possible, it said it's as if it was built in a house. Rava points out what's the meaning of this extra wording is to say that the canopy is only a problem when the canopy creates more shade than sunlight, because you end up already having a level of schach that is no good, non-kosher schach. But if the sunlight shines through much more than the shade, then it's not a problem. So a challenge we have, it ends up being not really a challenge because all we did was clarify what Rava meant, but a challenge to how we initially understood Rava. We thought that means, if you have this big branch going across, but there's not much shade, there's no problem. So we had a challenge, but at least under that branch, that part of the sukkah, and don't forget, that could still disqualify the whole sukkah, because if the sukkah was minimum dimensions and you cut it in half now with this other branch, it becomes too small a sukkah. So they could potentially make the whole sukkah possible, potentially. But at least it's making part of it not kosher. So we answered, Rav Papa says, yeah, you know what Rava meant? He meant you had these, you lowered them and you mixed them in. So then we asked, well, why would we use unusual wording in this Mishnah to teach that din when we've got it in the next Mishnah? Sorry, I skipped a step. Right, we said it's obvious if you just took it in and you mixed a small amount in, it's obvious it's nullified. Why would you need to teach that if it's obvious? And we said because you might have thought that although it does become nullified, maybe there's a gezerah, a rabbinic decree, you're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed to do this. So therefore, what our mission is teaching us is that there's no gezerah. You're allowed to make a sukkah like this. Fine. And we have the next Mishnah, which actually teaches this din, which then leads us to the next question. Well, if it's in the next Mishnah, why do you need to teach it here? Why put in this unusual wording to teach it here if it's in the next Mishnah? And so we answer, because the next Mishnah only tells us essentially if it happened. So b'diavad it could be. Might not be in the first instance. Might only be you're not allowed to do this. It did happen. So now what? Our Mishnah tells us that you're allowed to build a sukkah like this in the first instance. There's absolutely no problem. There's no decree. It's a 100% kosher sukkah that you're allowed to produce, no problems. Okay, that's that piece of Gemara. Questions? Comments? You want clarified?
Yeah, Rabbi,
Yeah,
I have a
yeah.
question. When they first started, the whole Mishnah started, it was talking about a two-story sukkah, right?
We mentioned that, yes.
But it looks like it's sharing the walls. They just go higher.
Correct.
So my question is, if the second story start from the top of the first story sukkah, because in case we're worried about the maximum height, or does it start, the wall start from where the wall of where it starts from on the first floor of the sukkah?
So it's going to start from inside, because the problem with the too high sukkah is that you don't see the schach. When the sukkah is too high, you don't. That's why there's an opinion that if you have this massive, like, mansion sukkah, you could even have you could exceed the maximum height because you see it's in your vision. So this would be the same as let's say, and again, like if you look in New York, sometimes people build in their apartment buildings, they build a sukkah on the roof. So from the ground level, it's too high, but we're looking at when you're inside the sukkah. So here's going to be from the inside. But we're going to get to this case exactly now. Well, we won't be able to finish the piece, but we'll start it. Sukkah al gabi sukkah v'chulu. That's the next quote, next part of the Mishnah. You got a sukkah on top of a sukkah. All right, so we're going to bring a brisa that's going to teach us where do we know this from, or what's the issue? Tana Rabbanan. So our rabbis taught us in a brisa, b'sukkos teishvu. In sukkahs you will dwell. That's the verse. V'loi b'sukkah shetachas sukkah. Now it's in, you dwell in the sukkah itself, not, which implies several things. One of the things that applies, and that's what's relevant to this case, is not a sukkah under a sukkah. V'loi b'sukkah shetachas ilon, and not in a sukkah under a tree. V'loi b'sukkah shebesoich habayis, and not a sukkah inside a house. In other words, the schach of your sukkah that you're in has to be what's creating the shade. It can't be under anything else. And this was what we mentioned before, by the way. The fact that we mentioned this when we learned the Mishnah, the fact that it said that under a tree is the same as a house, is it can't be to teach us essentially we learn it from the house, because they're all learned from the same verse. You don't have to come and teach us another law, right? And that was how we got into our question. So as you see from this brisa, they're all learned from the same source. So according to this brisa, the schach that you're under has to be what creates the shade. So if it's under another sukkah, even though you've got two levels of kosher schach, but your schach is not creating the shade. And you have a barrier between you and the schach that is creating the shade. Under a tree, your schach is not creating the shade. This thick canopy of trees creating the shade. Or inside the house, it's not your schach that's creating the shade, it's the roof of the house. So that's the source. Ask the Gemara. Adarabba. On the contrary. Okay, I get what you say about the tree. Good, under the tree. I get what you say about being under the house. But a sukkah under a sukkah, what does the verse say? Besukkos, plural, you live in. Besukkos tarte mashma. The word besukkos implies two. It's plural. So why can't you have a sukkah under a sukkah? I get it, what you say, that this has to be the sukkah that creates the shade, and not a tree or a roof of the house. But a sukkah under a sukkah, that's not excluded by the pasuk. It actually seems to be specifically included. So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok, he says, ba sukkos, it says, right, without the vav. So with the vav creates the plural. Without the vav, it can be a singular, right? So oftentimes when you write a word with a vav or without a vav, sometimes it's like the English word. Let's say you can say do not or don't. I mean, not to compare Lashon Kodesh to English, but it's essentially you can have a word that's the same meaning, just you have a shorter version. You have a shorter version. So you have do not and don't, and it's the exact same thing. However, over here, the fact that the Torah writes the word sukkos, which could be implied plural, I mean, in the context, it's talking about the Jews in general, and they're not all going to be in the same sukkah. So the context is the plural. So if it would have written with a vav in full, that implies you're right. It's not only plural that all the Jewish people are going to live in their sukkah, but implies two. But when we use a defective version of the word, so to speak, that it's written, yes, in plural, but in short, this is showing us only the context of the Jews are going to live in their sukkahs. That's what it means. But to be a sukkah in a sukkah, to be one individual, multiple sukkahs, that's not what it means because it's written in short. It's minimizing the power of this plural. It's not a full plural. It's only a part plural. That's what we have.
But Rabbi, isn't it just talking to more than one person? Basukot teshvu.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So it's saying, your sukkah is for you, and my sukkah is for me, and
correct. So that's what we say is Peshat. If it would have written the word with the vav in full, then you can imply that it also means that a person can be more than one sukkah. But the fact that it's written in the defective plural, it shows the only plural part of it is Jewish people as a whole. Each one's in their own sukkah. It doesn't mean that a person, in other words, it's minimizing the plurality. If it was written context plural and in full version plural, then we could say, it even implies that you could be in more than one sukkah. But the fact that the context is plural for all the people, but it's a defective version of the plural word, you can't extrapolate on that plural and take it any further.
All right. Yes. Thank you.
All right. Looks like we're out of time. Any questions before we finish up?
Yeah.
All right. So those who come Thursday afternoons, we'll see you there, God willing. And everyone else, I'm sure we'll have another opportunity in the future, God willing.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Sunday afternoons. Sunday afternoon.
For now.
Sorry, no, it was just today. Just
tomorrow
today.
Morning, he should be back.
I'm pretty sure it's if no flights are delayed and everything goes as it should, you'll have Rabbi Smith back tomorrow.
Thank you.
God willing.
Thank you very
No
much.
problems.
Thank you,
Take
Rabbi.
care.
Thank you.
Nice to meet the people I met for the first time today. Pleasure to meet you. Take care.
Bye-bye.